Katrin, welcome to Thinking Class. I've really been looking forward to our conversation since our LinkedIn exchange.
Hello, nice to meet you, John. I'm very happy to be here.
Excellent. I'm very glad to have you here, at least in this virtual realm that we've put together today. So it's the first time we've met properly, and I'm delighted to welcome you onto the show because I know we've got a good half an hour ahead of us getting into some pretty weighty topics, considering we don't have that much time. As you know, on this show, I want to take time exploring the ideas, values, and norms that made the cultures that we live in here in the West, and those that we think might be unmaking it, and how leaders might respond to those.
Yeah.
Before we get into it, you're a governance and ethics advisor to businesses. You get involved in political conversation around environmental, social, and governance matters. But what really made you interesting to me is that you're also a trained theologian. The reason why that makes me interested in you is if you go looking for any commentary on the business world, whether it's in the mainstream media or if you go on a LinkedIn, is that most people who work in an ethics role or make demands for ethical businesses or ethical business practices or for demands for people to act ethically, they make these requests without recognizing the origin story and development of these ethics. So that's what I wanted to explore with you today. So we've got a deep half an hour ahead of us.
Okay. Let's dive into it. Very happy to do so. It's a bit heavy.
It is quite heavy, but it keeps us on our toes. So Katrin, the world seems to be secularizing at a faster rate. Do you agree with that notion? And if so, why is it a problem?
Yeah, so I think before I answer this question, you're posing 6 questions to me, which I appreciate. And I think you're going from a very general, asking me about the phenomenon of religion and faith, to what is theology in relation to other sciences, and then what is the usefulness to business leaders. So I'm actually going to answer from a macro to a micro perspective, okay? So is it secularizing at a faster rate? I think that is an overall false perception, by the way. I don't agree. And I think what is secularization first? Let's say it's disassociating practices from their religious origins, okay? And what is secularism? It's actually the separation of the state from religious institutions. So there are 2 things. Is this true? Yes and no, that this is happening. I think we in the West feel like it, or we feel it, or people who do no longer believe think this is the case, but it's actually not. Because if you look at some of the numbers of organized religion, Christianity, that is true in the West, but overall, worldwide, it's not true. Okay, we have about 2.3 billion Christians in the world. That's Orthodox, Protestants, and Catholics. We have 1.9 billion Muslims, and that's growing at a much faster rate than Christianity because it's a younger population and their birth rates are much higher. We have 1.2 billion Hindus, okay, that tripled within, I think, the last 70 years. For various reasons, demographics and everything. And even Buddhists tripled since 1910. So in the last 100 years, from about 138 million to almost 500 million. So it's not secularizing at a faster rate. We have the absence of faith and non-belief, but we can argue even that in itself is a sort of religious notion. I think it depends on where you stand. But those people are officially only between 500 and 750 million, and a lot of those countries are actually within Europe. So Denmark, Sweden, Norway. You have Eastern Germany, which is very, very atheist. But you also have countries like Japan and Vietnam now. And interestingly, though, if we focus on Christianity now, you have some very high growth, especially in the global south, with Pentecostalism, which is a branch of Protestantism, and also in China. And I think nobody speaks about this. So I think it's worthwhile differentiating, and whether those people we then now sort of rank and count, whether they are all believing in practice is another thing. But I think as overall, as a mega phenomenon, I do think actually that there is a desecularization going on, and that a lot in the West and a lot of leaders do not recognize this. And so if I put this aside, looking at some of the economic impact, and I like to refer also to the overall wellness market, that is a big hodgepodge of a lot of things. That's depending on what kind of figures you take. McKinsey says it's $1.5 trillion large. The Global Wellness Monitor speaks of $4 trillion, okay? Within that, you have, of course, several foci, but there's also this mindfulness movement, and which uses a lot of spiritual practices. And that's very strong in the West, where people are searching and looking for a lot of things. So overall, is the world secularizing at a faster rate? I don't think so. You might see that differently.
I like the distinction that you made between secularization and loss of faith, at least specifically to do with Christianity. And actually, I think there's something in that. I read recently in a book by Professor Carl Trueman, which he spoke about there being, in the broad sweep of history, there have been three worlds that had been inhabited, at least from the beginning of Western civilization. In the first world, you had the ancient Greek thought, which had a moral code and order that was derived from beyond society, and that all of us were bound by some kind of fate. And then that ended up fusing with the Hebraic tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition, which said that we're in a law-governed universe given by a lawgiver, and that our moral order is rooted in scripture, biblical tradition, and that all of us are to respect the sacral nature of people and creation. I think where I might be coming from is the third world he talks about, which is there seems to be a subversion of that order. There's a throwing away of it. There's what has emerged within at least some cultural currents within the West is this idea of expressive individualism, where our moral order comes from our feelings and desires, and what we say goes, but we're not bound by meaning that already existed, and that it's our job to tap into that path. It's the world's raw material, and it's up to us to create what we mean by it. I wonder if you think that's a phenomenon.
Yeah, but I don't know whether values just derive from our feelings. I mean, if we look at the way we are civilized, the culture we live in, we are forcibly influenced by a lot of things, by our birth family, by the education, by the regulatory codes, which are very different here in France, or I'm German in Germany than to, for example, Indonesia, which has a very different, maybe Sharia code. So I think even if we see this individualization, I think that might be a bit too drastic to see it in isolation. Most people would agree that killing my neighbor isn't a very good idea, and I think in most, if not in all cultures, you have a sort of penalty or some codices attached to that, whether it's acceptable or not. So I might think this comes out of my feelings, because I feel like this isn't right, but there were some notions and codes that existed beforehand. There were some in Germany, we had this federal judge who discussed prominently about some of the pre-political conditions that shape actually politics. And he argues, he also was a philosopher and a Catholic, that there are some religious and philosophical elements. And I would agree with that, whether we are aware of them or not. I think that also depends. And yeah.
I agree with that too. Theology, then, something that you are trained in. It was once referred to as Queen of the Sciences. I would say it's probably not really, as you mentioned before, really even understood, recognized, acknowledged now. And I suppose in our elite culture, whether if you think about our universities, business schools, we prize things like STEM subjects. And so things like theology and philosophy are probably less likely to be championed as something worthwhile pursuing. But is it important for people to grasp theological matters in your?
I think let's just differentiate, because it's a very dense question, okay? In fact, you're asking me several questions. So theology is the study of God, you know. Is it in relation to other sciences explored? Is it neglected? Yes, but there was the Enlightenment. In the medieval ages, you had sort of higher faculties, which were law, medicine, and theology. That has changed because some of the political orders have changed. You know, we are no longer liable and answerable to the church, but to secular governments. So I don't think it is actually now more of a niche phenomenon and a cultural guiding force that is also due to some certain setups that are actually educational. You know, for example, in Europe, education overall is a public common good. So it was hotly discussed at several science political reforms. Is theology a science? Is it a scientific discipline? Because there are some budgets allocated to it. In the US and in the Anglo-Saxon system, also in the UK, by the way, education is a private purchasable commodity. So it's very different. So that is first theology and its place at university. You know, which overall it still has a place, but a private place in a lot of the Anglo-Saxon world at certain what they call divinity schools, whether they're in Yale, Harvard, Princeton, wherever, or in Germany at universities. And then it's often studied as a minor subject if you become a teacher. Is it still part of an overall general good education? No, but it used to be. Just as philosophy, you know, a lot of the leaders in the world, certainly in Germany, they used to study next to law, philosophy and theology. A lot of them are very broadly educated. But I think you also refer, and that's a separate element, to business schools, you know. And by the way, STEM subjects aren't necessarily taught at business schools. That's another issue. Yeah. But business schools, I think overall, again, that's got nothing to do with theology or any Christian values. I think and I'm not a historian of education, but I think if we look at the development of business schools, especially, let's say, the important ones in the US, you had in their inaugural addresses and declarations, you had the statements that they were trying to educate businessmen requiring a broad education. But then in the US, and that's more, I think, an economic phenomenon and also a scientific one, you had people like Milton Friedman very strongly coming into the 1950s. We had recessions and economic crisis. And within that was a slow sort of economic cultural change rather than a theological one. Those business school agendas and curricula changed, where they were much more looking at CEOs as agents of shareholders and restricting some of the curricula. And so I think this is an overall phenomenon that is actually not at all tied to the issue of theology, but to the notion of education as a whole. How do we educate our leaders? And our young people today? And I think they're educated not according to an Humboldtian ideal as a broad general education. You should be aware of certain things, but rather very narrow to be employable. And I think we saw this in Europe, in continental Europe, with the Bologna reforms in 1999, where we sort of aligned our educational system to the Anglo-Saxon model. And then the third thing is it important for people to grasp theological matters? I think it depends. I don't think we can say yes or no. It depends. It depends. Yes, if you look from a risk management perspective, if you say, okay, it's not a rule we live by or I live by, and my company is not managed by it, but it's a cultural guiding force, certainly in a globalized world where I work internationally. Does it matter? Does it matter in terms of regulatory setups? Yes, we have, for example, when we speak about the issue of sustainability, we have ESG, we have certain supply chain acts. So we will have embedded in some of the processes and supply chains, the clients, the countries we deal with. We have 55% non-democratic countries now in the world, you know, and I can't say whether that's rising or not, but I think there are certain pre-political or cultural and religious issues we need to take note of. Are they necessarily theological? No, but they might have Christian values attached. They might have Muslim, Buddhist, or Hindu values attached. And it makes sense, I think, in my opinion, if you are bored and if you want to do a solid board risk management, if you want to do justice to the various polycrises, to the mega phenomena, whether it's globalization, digitalization, desecularization, which change in work and family structures, you know, climate change. I think there are very different perspectives that exist in this world, depending on which culture you deal with. And this is why I think it makes sense, in my opinion, to, let's maybe not say be aware of theology, but be aware of religion and its impacts.
That's a very well put together argument. I'd agree. I think, and I would probably argue, even though I know you will then go on to make the argument that we're desecularizing, and to a degree I would agree with that as well. But I think for a long time we probably were bathed in a secular or an increasingly secular culture, at least in Western Europe, and I think we, with the growth of liberalism, which was ultimately on the back of Christendom, but then tried to do away with its origins and say, no, these are just self-evident truths. It's quite obvious that we have all of these inalienable rights, and with almost no reference to the ethic and transcendent values that people had to even come up with those ideas. But I think here in the West, we have tried to do away with at least gods, or at least the centrality of gods, faith, religion within public discussion. And I suppose that looking at our history, maybe that's understandable, given that there were great big wars over them for many hundreds of years. But I think you're absolutely right about if you're going to go operating in a or an international business, there's no good trying to approach it as we do here, with effectively excluding that whole way of being and the attendant ethics that follow from that view, because that isn't how everyone else views things. And unless you understand their values, those ethics, which either could be similar to yours or they might depart from those, then you're not going to be able to make particularly sound decisions on how you both relate to those people and do business in that part of the world.
But even I think at home, you know, even if we say, as you say about ethics, even then our perspectives are very different, you know, depending on what foundation I base my arguments on and what perspective I argue from. And within that, even if I say I argue from a non-faith basis, we might come to the same conclusions, you know. So I think it's not just in an international context, it's also much closer to home.
Okay, well, before we pressed record today, we were talking about this fourth question, which was, why do you think this world has passed into history and what's the impact of its passing? And you told me that, well, you don't think it has passed into history. And when I say this world, I'm talking about the Judeo-Christian world, I suppose, from us sitting here in the West. But if you want to take a wider one, you know, take a wider lens. Yeah,
I think, again, I would say it depends, you know, it depends from which perspective I'm looking at it. I don't think it has. I think there's a lot of it is secularized. So, you know, we can, it is actually ingrained now in our regulatory frameworks, in our constitutions, you know, so we take it for granted now for several generations because it's on that foundation and basis. We just don't evoke it anymore. And I had to think, when you asked me this question, I had to think about Max Weber, you know, who wrote in a letter, and I think this is now an idiom that's so famous, he's tone deaf to religion. you know. And if you think about it, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. You just don't pick up on it. Maybe because you've never looked at it. Maybe you've never been educated in it, which I think is a big case now, because let's face it, politics and religions are two areas also where a lot of people have very strong opinions. But when you scratch a bit, there's a very strong lack of knowledge and insight as well, which, you know, we might want to address that. We might want to say, can we look into it? And if I want to comment on these sort of issues, do I want to look on the development of the history of ideas? Does that make sense? Does it make sense in relation to my company, to the position I'm in? And I think I've just mentioned sustainability. You know, we're both in that area. There's also the issue that literally the subject of business administration and economics simply cannot answer a lot of the issues that are coming up in today's world. You know, neither can always mathematics. You know, sometimes we need to speak about qualifying issues before we can quantify them. And that often ends up being a philosophical, you know, but there might be some theological or religious elements coming into it, because interesting, those two disciplines, they developed often alongside each other as sort of, certainly here in the West, Christianity, once it became more structured, you know, and institutionalized, also try to develop and articulate answers to the prevalent philosophical movements. So they go to a certain extent hand in hand, and it makes sense, if you're aware of the one, to be aware of the other, you know. Just one example, you know, if you always say that, you can say to me, yeah, but Nietzsche said God is dead, you know. Well, we can also say the only one who's dead at the moment is Nietzsche. But also when you look at the fact Nietzsche's father was a German Protestant pastor, you know, what kind of, you know, what kind of baggage you bring with you when you argue ideas, you know, whether that's educational, emotional ones, philosophical ones, other cultural ones. I think it makes sense to, in the 21st century, to if you're a leader, if you are a manager, a CEO, or if you're also an employee, and you are interested in the world, to look at issues from multiple perspectives, even if you don't work in an international context, because generally the world is very complex, you know, and often there are no easy answers, and they're very complex ideas that have developed. So, what's the impact of passing? I think we can see that a bit. I don't think the impact of passing, I think it's more the impact of this general awareness is that we see a lot of erosion of certain values in our societies, you know, whether when we say values, whether that's from honesty, integrity, kindness, generosity, you know, or also societal standards, moral societal standards or business standards. We see that, that is changing, often not for the better. So would that change again for the better if we evoke those discussions? And I think that is open. You might disagree.
Yeah, well, one of your earlier points in that response was interesting, where you talked a little bit about how there are certain disciplines that they couldn't possibly have all the answers because you know, they're too narrowly focused. You're thinking about economics, for example. You mentioned sometimes you have to have a qualifying view, one that's qualitative, and it makes me think about, I suppose, the foundation of universities. You know, at that time there was, you know, to even have the idea of religious choice was a misnomer here in the West, insofar as, you know, you're born into a deeply Christian world, you're part of the Catholic Church. The universities themselves were created by the medieval church, looking for laws in a law-governed universe, and anyone who wanted to matriculate would have to go through a whole bunch of different views and disciplines, and then it would end in theology. And it strikes me that within modern universities we've created a whole splintering of silos, and that they find it harder and harder to speak to one another. And then I suppose we have graduates coming out with an extraordinarily narrow, abstract, logical, plan-focused structure about, if we just create these particular things, these particular plans, and focus on these data points, then we'll be able to create something really successful. And, we can control that thing. But we're missing that other aspect of what it means to be human, besides our ability to plan for the future and all those things, which is, who are we and who are we to become? And whether or not you believe in any of the, the transcendent foundations of our civilization, is ultimately a couple of things. One, the ethics that we might so prize today came from that way of seeing and didn't come out of nowhere, as we've talked about. And I think we do need to reckon with that in some respects, is that to form a culture, we need traditions, we need institutions, we need to be able to inculcate people into a way of seeing that's going to help perpetuate us as a culture. And I know there are various commentators who think we might have created an anti-culture where we're forgetful and dismissive of history. We create works that seek to subvert the sacred order, and that in the end will begin to have an impact on the values that we've come to hold dear, because our worldview will change it.
Yeah, but I think some of those interpretations change over time, right? So at one point, for a very long time, let's say death penalty was a very acceptable form of punishment. With us in the West, it isn't, and we refer back to it. So I think we can say and I think maybe that leads over into your next question. Are there things that remain, and in what kind of form, or are they sort of set for a limited time and then we completely move on, which I don't think that is the case. But I think they might change shape and they might change in interpretation.
Yes. So that question is, what values do we think are important to save from Judeo-Christian theology? And what on the face of it seems to have passed away?
I'm not sure it has passed. Again, I think it's probably been integrated into a largely secular regulatory framework. If we think of 1945, the UN Human Rights Convention, that wasn't sort of developed out of nothing, or 1789, the Declaration of Human Rights in France here, that wasn't also created out of a vacuum. So I think it's largely integrated. Again, I think we take them for granted now. We have been for a couple of 100 years, at least in the West. In some other countries, they're fighting for it still. They haven't managed to pass this. I think there are certain, if we take Christianity, of course, it's the 10 Commandments, you can say the Beatitudes, everything, but they largely have been integrated. And we can say they have also been ethics. It's, it's a subcategory of philosophy, and it's a structured system of principles, from which we get societally accepted standards, morals, and values, individually accepted standards. And I think they largely derive from Christianity, but they are now, they are also called secular. Have they passed? No. But as I just said, maybe some of them have been stretched, enlarged. Maybe some have been narrowed rather than broadened. Maybe their interpretation has changed over time of what is acceptable as culture has evolved, and as a lot of parallel insights, culture, economy, law, a lot of innovations have come about. I think we needed to have adapted this. But do they have passed? I don't think so, not in the West. And I think in other non-Western cultures, I can't comment for that, but I see them, if we look at some autocracies, they seem to be very desirable because they help us to live together with our political model of democracy, to live in a free society. And that is very precious and, highly regarded.
I couldn't agree more. Tom Holland, one of our favourite historians here. You're nodding, so you must have heard of him. What wonderful man. So he did a conversation with Bishop Robert Barron, who's an American Catholic bishop. And anyway, I will put it in the show notes, and it's something that you may want to listen to. But within that, he makes a passionate plea for people to try to understand the genealogy of the morals that we have, the idea of all being, well, one, equality, but in the respect of, in the eyes of God, before the law, our care for the sick and downtrodden, where we've become so congenial to the stranger and the foreigner, neither Gentile nor Jew, the Good Samaritan. And it's a really rousing speech that he gives within that, actually, because he's someone who was brought up in the Anglican tradition. His faith waned as it does as he went to university, and he's never really said where he stands on it all now, other than he thinks we're on the precipice of losing something precious, and that we're cannibalizing those stories. I know your time's precious, and we're coming into the end zone, but a couple of quick fire questions for you, Katrin, before you go. Is you're German, you've lived in the United Kingdom, you now live in France. What's the difference between how the elite institution from each of these nations embody values that are typically thought of as British, French, and German?
I don't think they're very different. I think, first of all, we're European, so it's the same sort of cultural guiding forces with nuances. I think we have different models. There's a state church in the UK, a Christian state church. There's the laicism in France, so the absolute separation between church and state, so total secularization. And we have what we call a sort of limping model, so a close cooperation in Germany. So there are three different. I don't think that any of the values are very different. What we can of course observe is the way that we speak about religion and faith. But that's also a cultural phenomenon, is very different in those three countries. I have made the experience that in the UK and Germany, it's quite freely spoken about, whereas in France, it's very much a private matter. But we might also put that down to more Latin cultural aspects. Has that to do again with religion and that separation? I don't know. So I think there aren't any strong differences as such, but they're more sort of small nuances. And I think in certain values, we're governed by the UK is no longer within the European Union, but generally we are governed by very similar sets of rules. We are all democracies, even though we might be a parliamentarian one or semi-presidential one, or a constitutional monarchy. I think in itself, it's the West with a mature democracy, so I don't see a big difference. Somebody else, if you ask a political historian, he might completely disagree, but I think from now a theological perspective, no. If you would have given me Indonesia or the global South, I think there are big differences.
I'd agree. Final question. If you had to give one bit of advice to the leader of an elite institution about what would you tell them about embodying the values that you care about?
Can I tell somebody to embody values? No, I think one can encourage people to reflect, and I think that's very important. These days, I think a lot of people are very confused, also leaders, because we have so many crises, we have so many parallel phenomena going on. And I think we also grapple with establishing sort of new orders. If we look at cyberspace and things, that's very important. Yeah. And so I think when we reflect on those issues, I encourage to look and take potential theological, but also more over philosophical aspects into consideration. And also from a like I said beforehand, from risk management perspective, because they do play a large role, whether that's now in politics, whether it's in business, where we have sustainability, climate change, whether it's also when we look at social cohesion. And I think we see that extremely strongly now with what is going on in the Middle East, which is more than just a geopolitical conflict. We have strongly religious tensions. And I think it makes sense to be generally and broadly educated in order to face some of these real large and complex issues we have in this world today. Whether I then believe what is being put forward is a whole other thing, but as a phenomenon that actually impacts my business, my organization, that impacts our rule-making or our living together, I think it's very worthwhile. And in my opinion, it's essential in order to answer to these challenges today.
Hear, hear. I will refrain from coming back with a weighty monologue. On that note, Katrin, I think that's a great moment to finish. I want to thank you so much for coming and joining me on Thinking Class and for being a bright spot today. And I hope that we get to catch up again in future. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining me in Thinking Class today. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to Thinking Class YouTube channel @ThinkingClass and follow me on X @ThinkingClasses. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.